The term paper proposals are due in a couple of weeks, right? Yes. That means this week I'm going to put up some sample papers because I think you're now all starting to get tuned in on the term paper issue. You should come to talk to me or talk to your GSIs about your topic. The biggest danger or the biggest first step in coming up with a topic is not making it too broad. Because every term I get proposal such as I want to write my paper on the changing position of women or the changing status of women in the United States since the Civil War. So that's just too big. If you're interested in women's issues and women's lives, think about the specifics, something a little narrower, and maybe narrow it down to one period of time, like the 1920s or the 1890s, or some events. Or if you're interested in women and labor, think about some of the unions or the strikes that women have been involved with. Keep it real, in other words. Get it down to something more specific. And the second thing that you should think about is, history is about change over time. In order to know what the change over time has been, you actually have to understand something about periods of time in the past. And so, in some ways, maybe the most important thing is for you to take a subject that you have an intrinsic interest, a personal interest in it, and find out how that worked, how something worked at a period in the past. Look at what you can find out about it specifically. Don't worry about what happened before or what happened after. The what questions. What actually happened? How did they advertise men's clothing in the 1920s? Look at some advertisements. Don't worry about advertisements from before or after. Just try to figure out what is it they're doing when they advertise men's clothing or women's shoes or toys for children. What's going on? Or what were the rules for baseball, in 1918? And then, how did things work? The what question and the how question are more important. Later, if you're lucky, then you might be able to answer a why question. We'll be talking about this more, and be sure to talk to your GSIs about this. And I will have some sample papers that cover a range of topics, very different styles, and they all got A's. So it should give you a sense of examples that fit the way you think about things. So today I want to go on to the rise of Jim Crow and the development of a racial system. I think we should look at, I want to do another little review of the themes. Between 1880 and 1910, there was an overall growth in the U.S. economy. It was a dramatic growth. And there was growth in wages at pretty much all levels, except in agriculture. And there was a decrease in prices. There was more opportunity, there were jobs available. So when you looked at it from the distance, corporate capitalism worked and seemed to work pretty well. But the country was also getting violent. There were high levels of poverty, and that was something new. There were a large percentage of people who went through the process of industrialization or modernization or whatever you want to call it, and they suffered greatly. The corporate form of organizing property and production survived, but it did so on the basis of a set of compromises. Farmers wanted to protect themselves from the vagaries of the market, particularly as they experienced it. They weren't really concerned about other people's problems. And they were able to secure legislation at state levels and then eventually at the federal level that did that. Trade unions used the market power of skilled workers to establish strong, stable organizations that could force employers to negotiate contracts and get even higher levels of wages and decreased hours, and to some degree succeed in limiting managerial prerogative about what happened in the assembly line. Middle-class reformers, we haven't gotten to them yet, but we will in a little bit, insisted that social policy be aimed at developing the common good and establish conditions for supporting individual self-improvement. And ultimately, they secured legislation that limited the ability of corporations to cooperate with each other, to form cartels and trusts, and which broke up corporations that grew so big that they could unilaterally control the market without regard to their competition. The power of corporations to do what they wanted were limited by principles of cooperation and solidarity and public good, all of which set some limits to private property rights. But private property remained important to farmers, to skilled workers, and to middle-class reformers alike. Now, if you remember Andrew Carnegie's short piece, Wealth, which I asked you to read towards the beginning of the class, I got a question over the weekend about what were Carnegie's motivations? Were they genuine? Did he really want to help people? And or did he have some sort of ulterior motive? And the correct answer is both. He did want to help people, he was genuine, but he also had some ulterior motives. He genuinely believed that he and other businessmen had found a magic key for how to accumulate wealth and improve the lives of everybody, and he was going to set an example by applying the sort of what corporate leaders had learned to the question of charity, and in the process, charity would cease being called charity; it would become philanthropy. And he would go about to solve problems in a big way. So, 1890 to 1905, he provided millions of dollars to build a public library system, and indeed built 12,000 libraries, public libraries around the country, and in most towns that are over 100 years old. The core of the public library system was based on the money that Andrew Carnegie gave them, which built the buildings and also helped them buy the books. But at the same time, he didn't like all this clamoring for cooperation and limiting the power of corporations. So part of what he's saying is, hey, we've built wealth, we know what to do with it, don't kill the goose that laid the golden egg, to reduce it to a cliche. Trust us. We will continue to make your lives better. And so what he's doing is trying to convince people that they shouldn't interfere too much with private property rights and the ability of managers to make the best decisions given the resources they have. So the reforms did not benefit everybody equally. Most farmers, and increasingly it became a majority of farmers, found it harder and harder to make ends meet. Those who survived were dependent on the government to protect and even subsidize their activities, while the majority of farmers sank into debt. And independent farmers became tenant farmers and then sharecroppers, and then finally their children started to abandon farm life altogether and move to the city. So even with the compromises, even with the success, that the farmers' movement achieved, given the way the economy was going, you didn't need to have so many people in agriculture. And so you had a process of creative destruction where more and more people were going to leave agriculture and go find jobs elsewhere. That meant that if you were a farmer, your life was still rather insecure and maybe crazy-making. And successful farmers increasingly relied on cheap migrant labor. And they were constantly in search for the cheapest migrant labor they could find, the most defenseless migrant labor, and ultimately became workers of color, which gets to today's topic, the development of race, who provided the most defenseless and the cheapest labor that they could get. And when you start reading the Carlos Bulosan book, the first section is about life in the Philippines under the U.S. Occupation or colonial government. The second section is about life as a migrant agricultural worker on the west coast of the United States in the 1920s. And it's not a pretty picture. And it appears to be a very accurate picture from what historians have been able to put together. While agricultural workers had the worst situation, most wage workers, even though they were making more money, lacked even minimal union protections. And those workers who did gained even more money and greater respectability. They looked upon their skills, so if you were a skilled worker, you looked upon your skill as if it were private property. Something that by virtue of being scarce was worth more, and you were going to make sure that it remained scarce. You weren't going to allow anybody who wanted to become a plumber to become a plumber. And this underscored the highly segmented labor market in which race and ethnicity determined the opportunities available and the chances to accumulate wealth. And middle-class reforms, this is a preview because we haven't gotten to it yet, were a patchwork of ideas implemented in individual areas, and often there were only weak enforcement mechanisms. And so that publicity and public discussion remained one of the most powerful forces for changing the behavior of the wealthy and powerful. But frequently, reforms reinforced power and privilege, as with Jim Crow legislation. Jim Crow, the imposition of segregation, formal segregation in the South, was actually part of the social reform movement. It was not some carryover of ancient prejudices. It was an effort to apply modern knowledge to the problem of how to get people to live together. But so far in this course, we've been looking at struggles that revolved around different conceptions of how markets might function and the rights that individual property owners had in relationship to community rights. There was plenty of bad behavior all around. In aggregate, people were trying to work for their best interest. Not actively to hurt others. If others were hurt, that was too bad. Life was tragic. It's a crucifixion. And suffering should have a redemptive power in people's lives, or at least that's what people were learning in the churches that many Americans attended. Your job, if you were suffering, was to come up with some sort of strategy for protecting yourself against the unpredictability of a rapidly expanding industrial society. When we come to the reorganization